A huge welcome to everybody. It's great to have you along this evening, and I'm super excited about tonight's session on neurological fatigue and strategies for managing it. I'm confident that this is going to be actually a really helpful session. It's an enormous privilege to have Dr. Christine Canty with us this evening as well. A couple of months ago, I was listening to a really helpful podcast in which Christine was being interviewed, and I found the podcast just really informative for understanding neurological fatigue, and I immediately thought of you all and was like, this is good stuff. And so I reached out to Christine, and listening to the podcast, there are three things that really stood out to me. And firstly, Christine's knowledge. She's got a PhD in clinical neuropsychology and years of experience in neurological rehabilitation, and a wealth of experience and knowledge. But secondly, what really impressed me too was not just the knowledge, but Christine's ability to articulate that knowledge in a really clear way that was relatable and approachable, and helping us understand the causes or the mechanisms behind neurological fatigue. But I think perhaps most significantly for me, though, and listening to the podcast and then in our subsequent conversations, I've just been so impressed by Christine's genuine care for people. I felt that it really shone through, and Christine, even apart from your knowledge and experience, you seem like just a really awesome person. And so I'm really looking forward to just spending this time with you and learning from you, and just so appreciate you being here. So thank you.
Thanks, Nick. That's a really beautiful introduction. Thank you.
No problems. Oh no.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. So, I'm going to talk to you guys tonight about understanding the impact of brain disorders on fatigue and energy management and strategies for the real world. So, as Nick kind of pointed out, my focus is really on trying to translate kind of brain-based knowledge into kind of actionable, understandable information that we can actually take and do something with. So I'm going to take you through some of the analogies that I use. So I'll start us off. Well, we'll start with a karakia. Tukua te waira kia hina kamota. Hai arari ia tatu mahi. Me tā tātou whai ina tikanga a ratuma, kia mau, kia ita, kia kori ayanaro, kia pupuri, kia whakamoa, kia tina, huie, takie. Okay, so my plan. I'm going to start with some brain basics, just going back to some sort of fundamentals, because they're we need to kind of understand the core of that in order to sort of take the next steps, where we're going to come into understanding the brain and energy use and fatigue. And then I'm going to go through an analogy that I use that I call the brain bucket. And we'll talk about some kind of examples and some scenarios for that. And I know Nick's got some examples. I've got some examples, and I'm really keen to hear if people feel like sharing, if you've got any examples as well. And then we're going to talk about a few sort of brain hacks for daily life. And as Nick said, feel free to just kind of unmute and jump in at any point if you like, or raise your hand or put it in the question in the chat, whatever works. Okay, so brain basics. When we're thinking about brain cells, we've got the key sort of two parts of brain fundamentals, the grey matter and the white matter. And so first of all, in this kind of lovely neuron picture that we've got here, that bit looks white, but that's actually the grey matter, the body of the cell. And over here on the diagram, it's purple. But when we're looking at a brain after autopsy, they're grey or white, which is where the name sort of comes from. And you can see here, I guess, just this one on the left, which is a model from real brains, just how incredibly complex this is. But so essentially our grey matter is the body of the neuron, and it's where the chemical processing takes place. So this is where the neural decisions are made via chemical changes that lead to electrical impulses. That's the kind of basics of it, is that there is a chemical change at the cell wall, and then that chemical change leads to a depolarization, and there's an impulse that gets then transferred along an axon. And the axon is generally the white matter. So that's just the long sort of stem along here. And that's the fiber pathway that carries the electrical impulse. So the decision or the message from the body of neuron, and that carries it along from one neuron to another. Not all axons are white. They're white when they're myelinated. So this is a different cell, not a neuron, but another type of brain cell called glia, that sort of wraps around the neuron like this to provide some insulation, kind of like the insulation of the sort of plastic on a chemical, so not a chemical, on an electrical kind of lead. And that essentially helps the message inside travel more quickly. So that's our brain kind of basics, grey matter and white matter. And now this slide just shows you, first of all, just how kind of amazing. First of all, the brain is. So this is this is an image from it's a special type of MRI scan called a diffusion tensor image, and essentially what it does is it shows you kind of visualizes the movement of water within kind of water molecules within pathways, and so each one of these kind of lines here is a fiber pathway. And each color is a different direction. So you can see that there's a great big sort of blue fiber pathways coming up from the spinal cord up through to the brainstem. And then we've got the red in the middle that sort of cross from one side of the brain to the other. And then coming right out to the sort of cortex. So incredibly complex connections within the brain. And for our purposes, when we're talking about energy, the key thing, I guess, is that the brain requires energy to send those electrical impulses throughout the brain fiber pathways. So anytime anything is happening in your brain, and of course there's always something happening, and often we've got lots of things happening, but anytime that's happening, your brain requires energy to send those electrical impulses. And when you look, at a picture like this, you can see just how complex that actually is. And so then when there is a brain disorder present, like for example, MS just being one of the example that a few of you guys have shared is affecting you, the brain becomes less efficient at sending these messages and requires more energy to do so. So in MS, we know that there's a problem with the myelination, so there might not be as much myelination, and so the connections, the sort of messages that go between connections can get lost, or it's harder for them to be sent, and so it's less efficient. Okay, so talking about essentially that any type of brain disorder results in an inefficiency. And the type of neurological disorder you have might give you a clue as to where you might require more energy. So, for example, people with concussion often require more energy for balance and vision because the brainstem pathway that we can see kind of here in blue is often very much affected by something like a concussion. People with Alzheimer's disease need more energy required for remembering important information and finding their way around complex environments because it's the mesial temporal lobes that are involved in Alzheimer's disease. And for example, we've talked a little bit about MS. It depends very much on where what symptoms you have or what sort of part of the brain is involved, and that's going to be the same kind of thing for FND as well. So, for example, in MS, if you have visual symptoms and word finding difficulties, the brain pathways involved in vision and language are likely affected, and these areas are likely using more energy at baseline. Now, that's an important kind of thing to note is that often we might not always have kind of symptoms in those areas, but if you do have at any point symptoms, then that gives you a clue that even when you don't have symptoms present, your brain is still using a whole lot more energy in the background in order for you to not have symptoms. because if they come out at some point, that there's something kind of underlying that we want to be able to understand. And this is where we can start to get a good handle, I guess, on what's happening in our brain and how to kind of work with that. Because if we can really understand what's going on, we can make some changes. And so I'm going to talk about the this kind of concept of the brain bucket and neurological symptoms. I was telling Nick before as we started that I've just started playing around with ChatGTP, helping me to make images, and I won't scare you all with the first image that it gave me when I put in brain bucket, because it's really quite hideous. But I did scare Nick with it just for fun. But this one's much more kind of palatable, I guess. The brain bucket I kind of think about as all of the space that you've got in your head, in your brain, for all of the different kind of cognitive processes and physical processes and bodily functions that are kind of happening at any one time. And each one of those kind of functions is taking up space in your brain bucket. What I'm going to do is kind of talk through a couple of examples of the brain bucket, and I'm going to sort of draw it onto my screen. Okay, so if we think about kind of what's happening in the brain bucket, excuse my writing on the screen, it's always a bit kind of messy, but I'm going to start with an example of a client of mine who I had recently, who is somebody who has MS and has done for quite a few years. And so what I'm going to talk about is how things were for her before she had MS symptoms in terms of the brain bucket, and then how things were for her after she had her MS symptoms in terms of the brain bucket, so that we can kind of get an idea of what's happening with energy and how that's being used, and then crucially the next step of how we can work with that. So she's someone who was working in a role in sort of the health sector, I guess. So a very kind of busy role. So if we think about all the things that were happening for her kind of day to day, first of all, her brain's, keeping a bit of energy, just keeping her alive for a start. It's doing all of the brain's doing things that we all kind of need us to do. Spending some energy on basic sort of vision. Spending some energy on basic kind of audition, just kind of hearing, on movement. And then she was kind of busy at work, right? So this is just kind of getting there, open your eyes and kind of moving around, but she's also processing language, and she's paying attention. And then kind of somebody comes up to her with a bit of a problem of something that needs to happen, or something that's a problem that she needs to kind of work on in the moment. And then she needs to be using her working memory in order to sort of hold that information in mind in order to work on what to do. And then perhaps also a little bit of problem solving at the top here. So a pretty full brain bucket, right? But still enough space for that sort of problem solving to sort of kick in when it needed to. So she was still very much kind of able to do her work and no kind of problems there. So this was kind of before, and now this is kind of after. So now if we kind of think about what's happening for her in her brain now. So still doing all of these things, still keeping her alive. Thank you, brain. Still, she didn't have any significant visual symptoms. So her vision was fine, still taking up the same amount of brain space. Still giving her audition, still kind of being able to hear. She didn't have any problems with hearing. What she did have is significant problems with movement. And so she was still kind of walking around, but needing to use, she was needing to use a kind of stick at times, and sometimes sort of needing to use a wheelchair. So I'm going to go with on the days where, say, she was needing to use a stick. So she's still kind of moving, but having to use so much more energy for movement because Now, rather than that all kind of happening automatically, she's having to do a lot more extra kind of thinking about what do I need to do to navigate this doorway. She's making sure that she's not going to be tripping, that the stick's not going to be getting sort of stuck on things. So some extra kind of energy going along there. And then language might be taking up the same space, attention taking up the same space. And then now for her, what we found when we did the neuropsychology assessment is that she had a specific, I'm going to say inefficiency, because it wasn't actually a real kind of difficulty for her. It was fine, but compared to her other skills, it was a kind of weakness. And so for her, working memory previously sort of taking up this amount, now working memory is previously taking up this amount. Oops, working. And so at that point, when she's got this problem and she's sort of trying to kind of hold it in mind, because the brain bucket's quite full, in order to do the problem solving, there's not quite enough kind of space there that's kind of taking it over the top of the bucket. And so what happens then is that the brain gives a bit less space to whatever it can that's taking up more energy. So for example, it might sort of devote a bit less energy to movement, in which case she might find that she's has a trip, or is finding it more difficult to sort of keep her balance, for example. Or it might be that she's trying to problem solve and brain's not able to hold that information in mind because it's trying to do all of these things at once. But the thing that's taking up the most energy is going to be sort of squished down a bit to try and include all of the things that are going on there. And so that's when you start having a working memory lapse, and start having that sort of cognitive difficulty. For her, one of the things that we sort of looked at was, okay, what's kind of, in the brain bucket kind of now, I can't change the fact of kind of what's happening, what my symptoms are, but I can potentially take some things out of the brain bucket. So, for example, for her, what she decided to do was, when she was at work, she decided actually to just be ambulating using a wheelchair, so that she could sort of take away all of the energy that was going to movement out of the brain bucket and give herself a bit more space for working memory or problem solving, or some of the other things that were sort of going on there. So that's what she decided to do once she sort of worked out how much brain space was being given to something that was challenging for her. The other thing that's often the case is fatigue, and emotions are the other things that are often taking up a whole lot of space in our kind of brain bucket. And I'm going to come back to that, but I might just stop there for a moment and just see if anybody's got any questions about that, on that sort of concept of the brain bucket and fatigue so far.
I might have missed a bit when you said about using a wheelchair to make it easier for the movement, the working memory. Was that the same concept, using the wheelchair reduce the working memory, or is that something else that she used?
Yeah, it's kind of I might put it onto this next one to sort of show you. So it's so essentially what you want to do is be able to sort of take one of these things out, whatever one is there out, so that if you can take one out and then create that space in the brain bucket, whatever you take out, it sort of doesn't really matter, as long as you're taking something out of the brain bucket that then gives you enough space that's left there. So for her, she took out all the energy going towards movement by using the wheelchair. That was her kind of decision. And then that left extra space that could either be available to give to working memory, so that wouldn't be inefficient, or it could be available space for to be able to become a bit more fatigued at work without it affecting her sort of thinking ability. So it kind of gives you a bit of space left over, and what happens with that space kind of depends on you, of sort of what you've got going on. And so for her, it was just that she decided that given that this one was taking up so much space for her, more than kind of what it was previously, that she decided that actually that was something that she didn't feel like that was a big part of her job, that actually it was more important for her to be sort of thinking clearly and be able to hold things in mind. So that's what she decided to take out. But it could be anything.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Hi, Christine, David here. You might be covering this later on, but this is kind of seems like a snapshot in time, because I mean, for me, these things would change over the day as well. So
Yes.
the bucket fills up more and more as you go through the day. You might be covering that later on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. And so I use this analogy for both a snapshot or kind of over time. I think it can sort of work for both of those, but you're absolutely right. Lots of people find that sort of changes across the day. And one of the things that most people find is that you might sort of be at this point and you're working, say, for example, you've got all of these kind of cognitive or physical things happening in your brain. But then as the day goes on, then you have fatigue that sort of comes into the brain bucket. And so that makes everything harder. And then the brain starts kind of squishing down each of these. And then as it does that, you start getting symptoms. And that's sort of what starts to happen. Is that the kind of thing you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you can either be sort of looking at that in at a sort of snapshot way and going, okay, what's in the brain bucket at this point? But the other thing to be doing is to be sort of thinking forward and going, all right, what does my brain bucket look like at the end of the day, for example? Maybe doing a sort of snapshot of this at the end of the day and going, okay, if I've got fatigue in there at the end of the day, what could I be doing earlier in the day that would stop that kind of coming in at the end of the day? Or maybe that's a bit ambitious to stop it coming in, but to minimize the impact of it, I guess. And one of the things that I really frequently see with my clients is that often when we first kind of sit down and go through this, people kind of say, well, I feel like I'm sort of all right in the first half of the day. And I might, I have a bit of a break for lunch, but then it's in the afternoon when things get really difficult, and there's nothing really that I can kind of change about what I'm doing in the morning, because it's not till the afternoon that the sort of fatigue kicks in. But then when you kind of work backwards and sort of go through, okay, exactly what are you doing at each, like cognitively, what's in your brain bucket at each kind of point. So I had a client recently. She's someone who had a traumatic brain injury, and she was working in a quite sort of high level role, and what she found was that she's doing all the kind of basic things. She's got vision and language and kind of everything else. But in the morning, what was happening was that she would be paying attention to a morning kind of Zoom meeting that they all kind of had to go to. And then at the same time, she would be sort of checking her emails. And then what is inevitably happening is multitasking is the thing that is there, rather than doing kind of one or after the other. And then she would sort of go straight on to the next thing of like the work that she kind of needed to be doing. And then she would kind of get to the afternoon, and that's when sort of fatigue would come in. And so what we had to do is that at that point, she was kind of going, well, I've already done all of that. That's already kind of happened. I can't sort of change that. And now I'm fatigued. But that was kind of happening each day. But what we ended up doing is going back and looking and going, okay, so could we actually take this multitasking out? So could it be that you pay attention to your Zoom and then do that, and then do the emails kind of after that time? And then when it comes to do the work, you turn off the notifications for emails so that you're not kind of multitasking there. And in between each one of those kind of things, you add just a 5-minute eyes away from the screen kind of break of sort of downtime. So by the time you get to this point of the day, the fatigue might still be there, but it might be sort of that amount rather than kind of that amount, because you've gone back and looked at what were all the things that built up throughout the day. And I only noticed them once my brain bucket got full, but actually they were starting to build up well before that. So that's often one of the things is that kind of working backwards and sort of looking at all the things, because often when I go through this with people, that one of the big things that people notice is just how much our brains are doing for us all the time. Like there's so much stuff going on, and when there's a brain disorder involved, those, all those kind of little things that we kind of take for granted, like thinking quickly or holding something in mind, just take that bit more energy now. And so they just take up that bit more sort of space in the brain bucket. And so we've just got to try and really think in a fine-tuned way about what can we take out, or how do we sort of proactively stop things from coming in, like fatigue, or like, the other big one is which again we're going to sort of talk about a little bit, but is some of the sort of emotional and psychological responses that can come from this. Because often what happens is that, one of the things that I see really commonly is that people sort of get to this point where fatigue is there, and then your brain tries to do whatever it can to create some space. And so it might try and squish this down, and all of a sudden then you're finding that you can't, you've got word finding difficulties. Or it tries to sort of squish this down, and all of a sudden you find that you can't quite get, your depth perception is a bit off because you're not sort of quite seeing things properly. Or this kind of goes down, and all of a sudden you've kind of said something inappropriate in a work meeting, or kind of something else. Or a really common one, somebody comes in and says, right, this is what happened with the boss, and this kind of big awful thing has happened. And so then there's a big emotion that kind of sits in here, and without the space to kind of manage it, there might be a bucket overflow. And that's when people lose their shit. And that kind of happens sometimes as well. So it's just that kind of provides a bit of a framework for working backwards and getting a really fine-tuned understanding of what's filling up your bucket, what's kind of there for you. Nick, do you want to tell us about the example that you were telling me about the other day?
Yeah, so I went on 2 trips in the last month or so. And first was a trip down near Lake Tekapo, into the Two Thumbs range. It was a ski touring trip. I went in with a mate of mine, and our plan was to tramp up to this the saddle, ski up there in this amazing untouched snow for a couple of days. Going into the trip, night before, I'd got some crap sleeps. I drove for 4 hours to get down to Lake Tekapo, which is, for me at this point, still quite a load from a visual processing perspective. And then we got tramping. Our packs were about 35 kilos with our skis on the back, and which was like quite a bit more than we were both expecting. And my friend, who's like in his mid-20s, he was struggling as well, which was comforting, but it was hard work. And then the next day, started ski touring up to the saddle, and it was just considerably more physically more hard work than I expected. We didn't have a tent, and so I hadn't slept great that night again as well. And so I was just feeling very, very fatigued. And as we were climbing up, I was aware of just being challenged quite cognitively in terms of thinking and assessing the terrain and that kind of stuff. And then we got in a fair way, decided to sort of turn around because it was just starting to get, it was too long and hard. And so we went to ski down this ridge, and it was patches of ice and snow. And so it was not great skiing conditions, often in spots. And so I was feeling quite anxious about that because I had this big backpack on. And as I was going down, I found it really difficult to control my skis, and my legs began locking up, so becoming really rigid, which then made it pretty much impossible to control my skis. And then my pain levels were going off the roof, and got down to the bottom of this little bit, and my mate pulled out a mat I lay down on the mat in the snow for about an hour, just to sort of recover, and we had a chill rest of the day. Going to bed that night, I was really feeling anxious about the next day. So a lot of emotion there, like, oh, am I going to even be able to make it down? Poor sleep as a result. I woke up really early. I got up onto the ridge, and it was quite a narrow ridge, and so there was a slip hazard. So if I had bungled my skiing, I would have slid down an icy slope for quite a long way, which would have been not a good scenario. And so I was feeling very anxious about that. There was a lot of wind, so there was making things difficult. My cognitive decision-making skills were out the window, and then that was stressful because I was basically relying on my mate to make all the decisions. And that's a really stink scenario to put my mate in. So I was feeling bad about that. And yeah, it just ended up being a total mission to get down. It made it obviously in one piece in the end, but it was not very much fun. And then 10 days ago, I went climbing with a different mate. No skis involved this time. And we were out the back of Hamner Springs and on quite a big mission. And we climbed up onto this to this ridge. I was beginning to feel a bit fatigued again. Hadn't had a great night's sleep again. Feeling a bit fatigued. And I noticed that my word finding was beginning to go a little bit. And I was like, this is a bit of a red flag. And the weather was coming in, so it was starting to get windy again. So with some quite strong gusts, so I knew that there would be that sensory load of the wind and the sound and the movement, and we were going to be getting into quite a technical section. We wouldn't be able to retreat off it, so I knew that if we went into it and stuff had begun to deteriorate for me, that would have been a bad scenario, and things would have got worse in terms of my ability. So we decided to turn around. I noticed that my depth perception was a bit off. My balance was pretty off. But then we got back to the camp. We had a break, and we sort of like got out of the way of the weather, and we were able to chill for a little bit. And then we had a few more hours to walk out back to the car. And on that way out, everything was still off. I was still finding it difficult to find my words. Stuff was coming out really scrambled. It was kind of strange. I was aware that my problem solving was kind of not fantastic, but it was adequate. Movement was and vision was all a bit off, but it was fine. We were just walking down a river valley, and I think what was really interesting walking out is I was like, okay, it is what it is. Actually, there's nothing that can really go too wrong here. So I said to my mate, who's also called Nick, I was like, Nick, my language is just like my word finding is problems. So I'm sorry that this is all coming out scrambled. And he's like, it's fine. And so we just walked out and we had kind of a weird conversation. Well, weird because I kept on mixing things up, but a bit of a fun conversation on the way out, and it was all fine. It was quite a different experience from the final day of the ski touring trip. Yeah.
So I think when Nick and I talked about, so thank you for sharing your experiences first of all.
Worries.
Nick and I spoke about this the other day. One of the things that I've tried to kind of draw this as it was kind of going. So I hope I've kind of captured what I wanted to. But I think the things that we sort of talked about is that there was a couple of key sort of differences in this kind of first scenario compared to this sort of second scenario. And I think the things that we kind of captured in this sort of first scenario was first of all that there was kind of a double up of fatigue things happening. It was over a sort of couple of days. So there was the driving fatigue, first of all, getting there. There was the extra physical fatigue, not knowing that the packs were going to be so heavy and that it was going to be quite so intense. And then there was fatigue from poor sleep as well. And so then it got to this point where there was a high cognitive load in terms of the decision making because the terrain was difficult, and so the cognitive load of just having to decide where your body's going and what you're going to do about that is high, and the sort of physical load about that is high. And the thing that kind of struck me was on that first one, because these things were already sort of taking up so much space, and I think it does sort of come to that cumulative sort of analogy of the bucket rather than just kind of in the moment. They were sort of really getting there, is that When it got to this point, being sort of full, that's when it sort of got to overflow, where the symptoms were sort of coming in, and then that started leading to anxiety, and then that started taking up space in the brain bucket, and that started leading to more overflow, and that started leading to more anxiety. And so then you had this snowball, I
Spiraling out
guess.
of control.
Yeah, and so then what happened is that you had that sort of bucket overflow where you had to just put a mat on the ground and just flake out for an hour just to sort of recover from that. I mean, first of all, awesome, right? Like that's a good strategy. There's nothing
Yes.
wrong with that, like that's fine. I guess that's the first kind of thing to note is that one of the things in this is recognizing when your bucket is full and knowing that if your bucket overflows, you generally need to kind of clean it up. You need to sort of like let things kind of settle and kind of get a bit more space in the bucket. And the best way to do that is to rest. So just to be clear, I'm not kind of talking through these as one's the good example and one's the kind of bad example, but just to sort of as a way of kind of thinking about what happens in the brain bucket, because there were some similar things kind of going on here. Whereas on this side, there was still some poor sleep from fatigue, but just the one sort of night of it rather than the sort of double up. There was not the extra sort of high packs, but there was a high sort of sensory kind of load because it was really windy. So still quite high kind of cognitive decisions, still kind of a bit of a risky terrain. So still having to really think about where you're putting your body and visually kind of taking in a lot of information. But I think the key was, it's only a bit, it's just that because there wasn't these extra fatigue and high sort of physical work in there, that at this point, there's this kind of bit of space left to think. And when there's that bit of sort of space there, it sounds like, Nick, you were able to sort of think through, okay, I am sort of having some of these symptoms, but what am I going to do about it? I'm going to talk to my mate and go, hey, Nick, I'm sorry if I'm all scrambled. And he's like, it's fine, dude, don't worry about it. And so then that immediately sort of puts a halt into that potential kind of loop that was kind of going on there.
Yes.
And then you can sort of make that decision to use that bit of space left to like, all right, this is what I'm going to kind of do about this. And it was still a tricky day. You're still kind of having to think hard. It was still kind of physically hard, but you were able then to sort of make your way down the mountain without kind of having to, stop and lie down for an hour.
Yeah.
And I think that's just, when we talk this through, I kind of thought that's just such a nice example of when the bucket gets really full, you kind of have no choice but to deal with it. Your brain is going to make you deal with it in some way or another. And so just knowing when that happens and going, okay, that's fine, that's okay. When you can, learning from those situations and sort of going, okay, what was it for me that were the things that kind of took me over? And what were the things that started to happen just when I got to this kind of point here? Some, what we're going to come and talk about next is some sort of little hacks as ways to sort of short circuit that sort of snowball effect that can often happen with anxiety or just emotions in general, stress, worry, all of these kind of things. I see this a lot. People, when they might be having difficulties with attention or memory, and then what they end up doing is getting really worried about that. And so then the worry takes up a lot of space in their brain, and then they spend a lot of time monitoring and checking, and the worry and the monitoring and the checking are taking up heaps of space in their brain bucket, which actually makes their memory worse. And so then they're more likely to have a memory lapse, and then that sort of ends up just kind of cycling around. And if you can get a bit of insight into that, you can sometimes try and short circuit it a little bit. Any questions or comments about Nick's examples here? I'm going to try and write some notes on it so that when you have these slides, you might vaguely remember what I was talking about.
I was just thinking too, one of the things which I really like about this model is it does help, I think, with decision making, like in that climb, knowing that I was going to go into the more technical section of the ridge where I knew my anxiety would get more. The wind was increasing, knowing that a lot of those different components the intensity of them would increase. Actually, understanding how those act as load on the system, as it were, it made the decision to actually pull off before the bucket overflowed a lot easier because of the probability of it overflowing if we had continued. So it's really helpful, I think, for decision making too in the outdoors.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just kind of knowledge is power, isn't it? Because again, it's not there's not any sort of wrong or right. Like you can, it's not there's no problem with taking yourself to overload or taking
Yeah,
yourself to bucket overflow. That's fine. As long as you know that whenever the bucket overflows, there needs time to clean it up, and that's kind of one of the things that needs to happen. And I guess it's just sort of learning those things about yourself and making making those decisions. Like what do I want to do? Is this in line with what I want for myself right now, to sort of go hard and then have to be able to rest a lot after that, or to sort of have a bit of overflow? Or do I prefer for that not to happen, and then should I sort of pull back sooner and go to and take it down this other way? So it's not that there's a right or wrong way of doing that. It's just that it's making the decisions so that you're kind of driving the bus, rather than your fatigue kind of telling you where you have to go or telling you what you need to do and dictating that for you. It's you kind of making the decision that, okay, no, this is what I'm going to do about this. This is what I want to do.
totally.
Any other thoughts or comments on that before I move on to, I've got a couple more slides that I wanted to talk about a few different things. So I guess the take home of that is sort of thinking about, for you, what's taking up extra space in your brain bucket. Are there symptoms to do with vision or movement or memory, or is it worry or anxiety or fatigue? And what can you take out of the bucket? So sometimes it might be, if memory is a difficulty for you, then it's just putting in place some strategies to compensate for memory, because if you know that it's inefficient, then trying to make yourself remember a whole lot of things is going to be really challenging. It is going to take brain space away from some of the other things. So it's sort of sometimes we can kind of get into a bit of a fight, with it, and it's just kind of there's some acceptance that can come in, just sort of understanding, okay, this is how it rolls for me. This is what it is for me, and this is what I can kind of decide to do about it. And sometimes that might be strategies to manage anxiety or stress or worry or whatever it is, and sometimes it's rest to manage fatigue. And again, often when it's rest to manage fatigue, it's you really do need to look at that whole day of that sort of cumulative effect, because by the time fatigue has kind of taken up space in the brain bucket, it's generally been there for a while, and it doesn't tend to affect you until the brain bucket gets full, and then your brain's going to try and squish down all of the memory, all of the space that's going to other things, and that's when you might start having symptoms. And I'm sure we've all had that experience where you've had a terrible night's sleep and been really, really busy, and then you forget something really important and you think, oh shit, how did I do that? And it's just because your brain bucket is full. It happens to all of us. But what can happen is that sometimes we sort of pay more attention to those things, and I guess kind of put more meaning to them than maybe what's there. So often a lot of my clients get really worried when their brain bucket is full, and then they start getting fatigued, and then they start having symptoms, like they might have word finding difficulties, or they might become forgetful, or they might become a bit sort of scrambled in their communication, or whatever it might be. And so then they start sort of thinking like, oh, this is bad. Like this must be a sign of something bad happening in my brain if I've got to the point where I'm making mistakes, where I've got cognitive symptoms. And that's not necessarily the case. That just means that your brain bucket is full. It doesn't mean any more or less than that. And so if you decide to take your brain bucket full and those symptoms kind of come, then that's fine. It's just knowing that there's I guess trying to sort of short circuit so there's not that sort of snowball that happens after that, because that can often happen and make it worse. So one of the things that I want to talk about now is this kind of idea of the interaction between the physiological kind of side of our brains and the psychological side of our brains. Okay, you ready for this? Because ChatGPT did this for me, and I was pretty pleased with it. Ta-da-da-da. Seriously, it took it like 10 seconds. I was like, give me a two-sided coin with physiology and psychology. And it's like, yep, great, here you go. I was very impressed. And so often, I think often we have this sort of false dichotomy that brain symptoms are different to mind symptoms. Or that if something is, people sort of, oh, it's all in your head. And of course, it all is in your head all the time, whether it's physiology or kind of psychology. But if we think about physiology, we think about sort of brain changes. We might be thinking about sort of slowed processing if we're thinking about a neurological disorder, or cognitive symptoms, or sort of emotional symptoms that happen because of emotional kind of centers in the brain. And then we might sort of think of from a psychological point of view, it also kind of works the other way. So emotions make us heightened to physical perceptions. So if we're feeling a sort of psychological emotion, that affects the physiology in that it makes us more likely to sort of perceive certain things from the chemicals that sort of happen. And worry makes us more likely to notice cognitive lapses, and so that can affects the physiology as well. And the big one, that emotions kind of take up space in the brain bucket. So I think just having that understanding that the psychological side of things is not actually any different. They're just sort of two sides of the sort of same coin, and it goes both ways. That's the really kind of nice thing about this, is that you can have something happening in your brain that gives you an emotional kind of reaction, and then that kind of floods your body with this kind of feeling and all the kind of physical reactions that sort of happen as a result of that. But you can also work the other way. You can also use the physiological side of your body to send a bottom-up message to your brain that things are actually okay. And that they sort of work both ways. So kind of harnessing either, coming at things from the physiological side or coming at things from the psychological side, and understanding that interaction is really important. So one of the ways that we can do this, and I know that Nick's a fan and uses this kind of technique, is just the technique of grounding. Just kind of, I think, Nick, you use the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So is it 5 things you can see and then 4 things?
Yes, I generally always 5 things that I can see, and then for me at least anyway, I decide on it's always one thing that I can taste, because I can never taste more than one thing. But the others is more dependent on, like, if it's a nice place, then, or there's some birds or something, I'll be 4 things I can hear. If there's not much to listen to, it might be 4 things I can touch. So I kind of mix it around a bit.
Yeah, that's how I do it too, actually, because otherwise it can be stressful if you're like, oh no, I can't find the 4 things.
Exactly.
And so when emotion and thoughts kind of if they sort of take us over, so that we sort of flip to the psychology side of the coin, grounding can help us sort of connect to the physiological side by paying attention to our bodies. And that's kind of the short story of what's going on there. Basically, is that it's a way to help us harness that kind of connection. And instead of having this, psychological, emotional side sort of having a top-down control and kind of taking over, we can kind of flip it and sort of go, okay, no, we're going to connect to the physiological side and have that sort of bottom-up process. And it's really, really powerful. I think, like, when I first sort of learnt this stuff, or before I kind of learnt this stuff, I guess, I think I would have been sort of, inclined to think that it was a bit sort of airy-fairy, which sounds terrible from a psychologist, but it's true. That's kind of how I would have thought about it. I've always kind of been, much more interested in the sort of brain side of things, and I think before I really understood this, I kind of thought, oh yeah, that's the sort of touchy-feely, airy-fairy, makes you feel nice, but doesn't actually have any braces of brain stuff. And that just sort of shows how naive I was, and how much I kind of didn't know when I was starting out, because now I understand that it's actually an incredibly powerful thing. And how can it not be in your brain? Of course it is. Everything we think and feel is in our brain, but it can be really, really powerful. So just that sort of simple technique can really help you harness that physiological side. And then one of the other ones is this kind of idea of name it to tame it. So studies have shown that there is more brain activation given to a feeling that's kind of a bit nebulous, bit sort of undefined. This, you have that gut feeling where you're like, something's wrong and I don't even know what it is, but I don't want to kind of think about it. If you name it, if you actually kind of consider what it is and give it a name, then there's less brain activation kind of associated with it. It controls it, it tames it. And naming it takes it from a limbic system really sort of deep down in the brain to the frontal cortex to give that sort of contain it from some top-down control. Could be, there's my fatigue symptoms kicking in. Could be that's my anxiety. Thanks, brain, for looking out for me. That's my catastrophizing story. Don't worry, I've planned for this. Or hello, feelings monster, it's you again. These are all examples from clients that I've had. Or actually that second last one is me, the catastrophizing story. That's what I tend to do, go to the worst case scenario. And just naming that and going, oh yeah, this is what I do. I catastrophize, just helps me to kind of rein it in a little bit. And so I went back to Chat GTP to get some kind of images, and I was thinking about you guys doing your climbing in snowy mountains and thinking about, if there are some emotions coming along with you, some maybe there's some worry, maybe there's some kind of feelings that you've got that might be sort of getting in the way a little bit. And it's sort of thinking about, okay, name it to tame it, work out what that actually is, and then make a decision about how you're going to interact with it. Because when we think about, again, coming back to the brain bucket, everything that's happening in your brain is taking energy. So just you interacting, those emotions being there are taking energy. When I visualize my emotions, it's always like a Care Bear. And in my mind, it's sort of not as happy as this, but ChatGTP didn't want to give me an aggressive looking bear. It wouldn't let me. It was looking out for me, which I thought was quite cute. But if you think about, like, if those feelings are kind of, they're there regardless of what you do. So you can be trying to run up the hill and get away from them, but that's going to take a ton more energy if you're trying to outrun, because this guy's pretty big. It's going to catch you pretty easily. So that's going to take a whole lot of energy. So you might kind of stop and just turn around and try and have a snowball fight and just try and knock it over and just kind of spend all your energy fighting it. But also that's going to take some energy as well. And so what you might decide to do in the end is to just kind of walk up the mountain together and just sort of acknowledge that those feelings are there, but they don't have to be anything more or less than just being there. And sometimes just kind of acknowledging that can be the most energy efficient things to do and the best way of kind of managing fatigue. So they're the slides that I wanted to sort of run through. So I'll just kind of throw it open. If anyone's got any kind of examples from how they think they might sort of apply this to their life, or any other kind of thoughts about this stuff.
I was thinking about sharing it with others generally, like, because it doesn't just apply to MS, it applies to all sorts by the sound of it.
It applies no matter whether you have any brain disorder or anything at all. It applies absolutely. It's one of those analogies that's kind of the brain bucket is helpful for just fatigue management in general. Everybody has kind of fatigue that kind of comes in, but also those those kind of name it to tame it. Those are good evidence-based strategies that apply to everybody. Absolutely, yeah. So I'm happy to share the slides, and you're welcome to the video. It'll be up on the website, right?
That's correct. Yes.
I remember talking to Nick about some of these strategies years ago, and I've kind of forgotten about them. So it's been a really good reminder, and not just exercise when I'm exercising and stuff or on some sort of mission, but just in the day to day. Like I just had a really stressful early start this morning, bad sleep last night, stressful work morning this morning, and the physical fatigue was pretty evident right from the start, and I did not use any of those strategies, and it was really annoying, but I could see if I had used some, how much more helpful it would have been. So it's been so good to have a reminder because, about 2 years ago, I had a change of job and I have some stressful moments which can manifest in some ways with walking and stuff and balance, just like Nick was talking about for me. It would have been really helpful this morning, but I'll be able to use it tomorrow if I come across the same thing. Thank you. Great reminder.
Excellent. You're very welcome. I'm glad that it's that it feels like it'll be provide a sort of practical strategy. That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah. And I think too, Dave, when we talked about like the grounding exercises, I didn't. I'd found from experience and been told that it works well, and but I didn't understand any of the why it works, and so it's super helpful to get that information. Thank you, Christine.
Yeah, no worries. I'm someone who always I need to kind of know the why. Otherwise, I need to be convinced from the data.
Yes.
That's kind of how I work. So I kind of quite like to be able to sort of show the data. Yeah, and then.
Just something Dave said reminded me, like when fatigue is there right from the get-go, like struggling to get out of bed, like you haven't done anything else for the day. What do you suggest in those? You haven't really used anything in your bucket yet. You're still just lying there. What do you suggest for those days?
I guess it probably depends a little bit on what you had planned or sort of what you wanted to be doing, because I guess if there's the option of just having a kind of down day and letting yourself kind of go, you know what, I'm just gonna take today off and kind of, I want to say sort of reward yourself, not quite the word that I'm looking for, but just it's kind of just being kind to yourself, just kind of acknowledging that, yeah, okay, I'm fatigued, I might kind of need this. Having said that, I know that that's not often or not always a possibility to do that. And so in those cases, if there's not that option to just kind of take a sort of down day, then I think it's just kind of that's where some of those name it to tame it proactive fatigue management sort of strategies can come in. So it's just to sort of know that, okay, it's first thing in the morning and I've clearly got fatigue in my bucket. So I might not be at my cognitive or emotional best today. And that's okay. And just kind of knowing that might happen during the day. And so then if there are episodes of forgetfulness or word finding or difficulties with vision or sort of whatever it is during the day, just kind of acknowledging those and going, yep, I'm fatigued today. That's why, so that they don't end up kind of escalating. So it's kind of, I guess it's sort of damage control, I suppose. It's just kind of limiting how much that fatigue might affect you for the day, and knowing that I can't change it. I can't just kind of magic it away. It'd be great, but I can't. And so it's just sort of going, okay, well, I'll acknowledge that it's there, but I'll put in place these strategies so that it doesn't kind of snowball, so that I don't add all the worry and the rumination and the extra stuff that would actually sort of make it worse. And I guess the other thing just to add is that proactive fatigue management stuff that often I know it sort of feels, and I should say this doesn't kind of work for everyone, but I have probably most of the clients who I've worked with that it is still helpful when there's fatigue like that on board, is to just kind of think about, okay, well, yeah, I can't sort of magic it all away. I can't take it all away, but I might be able to add in some short kind of brain breaks of 5 or 10 minutes with ideally, eyes closed, not moving, but knowing whatever kind of works for you, basically. And knowing that, okay, they're not going to fix the situation. They're not going to sort of take that fatigue away, but they might prevent the fatigue from growing and taking up more space. And so just sort of putting those things in that you can do and getting some sort of control back. What do you think about those things? Would any of those kind of make sense for you, Annette, do you think?
Well, I've tried closing my eyes again in bed. Unfortunately, I can't fall back to sleep. But But yeah, the short brain breaks sound good. It's just a matter of remembering that in the day.
Yeah, and that's where it sort of comes into a bit of sort of cognitive rehab. It's kind of working out like, okay, how is this actually gonna kind of work for me? How am I gonna actually do that? And sometimes that might be just putting a reminder in your phone. Although for me, I know if I get really busy and I have reminders pop on my phone, I just bat them away. So it doesn't so much work for me. I need to kind of link it with something else that I am sort of doing. So I will generally sort of stop for lunch, and then I will make sure that I kind of add on a brain break if I need it in the middle of the day at that kind of point with something that I'm already sort of doing. And then it's sort of that's where it sort of takes a bit of pre-planning, because to plan these things on the spot when your brain bucket's getting full is a really big ask. It's really kind of difficult. So it's sort of maybe planning at the start of the week and knowing that, okay, if I have a day where I wake up and I feel already fatigued, here's my action plan. This is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to sort of manage it. And that can be containing just of itself, I think, having a bit of a plan of action.
Oh, thank you.
One thing which I have on my desk is a wee little timer, because a bit like you, I think if I set alarms or at least notifications on my phone or reminders, I just ignore. And at least with
Yeah.
this, it has like a slightly irritating beep. So it's like, oh, have to deal with that. And Christina, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. One thing which I have found really helpful is doing it is a stop, drop, and flop. And you sort of like taking a big breath and your shoulders up to your arm, your eyes closed, and you're like, and just kind of relax and flop. And do that a couple of times, and that's actually particularly if you can sort of do a bigger or something like that. It feels quite restful.
Yeah. And actually, now that you say that, that's just reminded me, I should have put a slide on this in. I'll add it if I do this talk again. But there's some recent research on something called the physiological sigh.
Ah, yes.
Have you seen that? Yeah.
Yes.
And that it sort of comes down to the vagus nerve, it physiologically quite sort of relaxing. So it's a big sort of breath in through the nose, and then at the end another extra kind of sniff in, which is and the extra sniff is important. It sort of opens up all the kind of right channels, and then a sort of slower breath out through the mouth. And that sort of physiological sigh is can be a really like has all the sort of physiological correlates of kind of bringing you kind of back down again. So even in those kind of days where you just like, I just can't afford a 10 minutes, I can't do a 10-minute brain break.
Yeah.
And for me, I find a brain break when I'm really stressed really hard to do, because my mind just runs. I can't shut my mind down that quickly. So it might be just that you add in, one of those kind of physiological sighs every kind of half hour or something like that, which you can kind of do, relatively quickly and still kind of get on with things. So you got to kind of work it out what's going to work for you and your life, and what's going to be tolerable and sustainable in terms of, actual strategies that will work.
I don't have a question, I just have a comment.
Yeah.
The naming to tame,
Name it to tame it. Yep.
yeah, is really helpful, because often when I have a bad day physically, I worry about being worried and builds on that. And my mum always says to me, just accept that you're feeling worried and just let it sit with you, because there's no point worrying about worrying it, because it's just like a self-perpetuating thing. So yeah, the naming to taming really helps with me.
Yeah, awesome. And and the thing is, it's hard, isn't it? Like when somebody says that to you, it can often be hard to be like, yeah, I know, but if I could just stop worrying, I would, you know. But I think the nice thing about name it to tame it is when you can really kind of personalize it for you. So you can kind of say to yourself like, oh yeah, that's my worry about worry. And it just kind of contains it. And it's, I really like that there's that brain research that shows that it literally does contain it in your brain. And it means that you can then spend your energy on the other things that are important to you, what's important to you to be doing rather than kind of anxiety. So that's good. I'm glad that it fits with the other things that you're hearing, and it sounds practical.
A huge thank you. That has been just, at least for me anyway, super helpful. And I too love the image of the name entertainment with the I love the Kia Bear too. That was actually really lovely. But yeah, I just so appreciate your time, Christine, and the effort that you've gone to prepare this presentation. And yeah, it just super helpful. Thank you.
It's my absolute pleasure, and I'll send you through the slides. And if anyone has any questions or thoughts afterwards, feel free to free to reach out. Happy to answer any questions.